a sense, there's a big challenge here in that both words are completely underspecified, personalised and games. I'm going to ask the panel not to get into the issue of what is a game. Just let's assume everybody knows what it is. It turns out that any two people have at least 3 definitions of what a game is. But we're not going to go there. But I do want us to go into the area of what personalisation is. Actually, when do you need it? When's it appropriate? When's it not appropriate? Why do you need it? When you need it? And what does it mean? And how do you implement it? If you look at a lot of the things that are said in Silicon Valley, it sounds as if personalization is just an advertising word. You know, personalization is good. Well, not if you're joining a synchronized swimming team, it's not. So personalization is not necessarily good, even in gaming. Or maybe personalization in synchronized swimming would be very good if you figured out what that means. What I'd like us to do in the end of the next 40 minutes is have a sense of the range of possibilities in personalization. Now, we've got 3 people on the panel. We've got Sebastian Alvarado, who's a postdoc research fellow here in biology here at Stanford. We've got Katherine Isbister, who, when she's not enjoying this year at Stanford, she's going to have to go back to NYU, where she's the research director at the Game Innovation Lab at NYU. And then we've got Romie Littrell, who's the Health and Biotech Project Director at the Tech Museum. Okay, we're going to begin with you. And just say what you want. We're going to try and make our way towards the issue of, you know, why we might need personalization, what it means, how you implement it, and where it leads you.
Of course. So in the context of games, I guess personalization is particularly important because as being a player, you are the agent of, you know, the narrative or the environment you're exploring. In that sense, your personalization is pretty much your choice and how you decide to interact with the world around you. Whether this has to do with any type of issue, I feel that being the player is already making a personal choice.
Oh, okay.
I
can add to it.
You can add to that if you want, because Catherine's got a 10-minute or something like a
10-minute
video.
Sure. So I mean, if I were to go into it, so I'll talk more, I guess, my role. So I'm developing one game right now that's basically a game where you play as cancer. In this game, you are identify with a disease that's a very equalizing factor. I mean, I think we're all in one form or another. We're able to get cancer. We know people who are touched by the disease. Despite this, there's a lot of unknowns. We have a lot of unknown approaches to therapy and the technology that's being used to study this disease, and in fact, disease in general. So what we decide to do with our game and our approach is to develop some sort of educational experience that drives off of what it is to be the disease. And with this case, you know, as an example, as personalization goes, you can understand either your cancer or somebody else's cancer, or even the story, the therapy, the cellular biology behind all of these things in a very interactive abstraction of the disease. And we feel that we've kind of achieved a sense of personalization because your choices, albeit under the control of the designer, me, are very controlled in the sense that we force choices onto the player that allow them to solve problems, but that experience in itself, despite it being under our control, creates a learning moment where the environment, the player, and you know, the non-playable components of the game are all interacting to kind of create this experience where the illusion of choice within the design still gives you you know, some form of understanding, because it's almost as if cancer as an entity had a mind of its own. You're thinking and making those choices for that mind. So that's how we've approached it. We feel that this is a start. This is just our first game, but we do feel that as disease and disease pathology goes, there's an abundance of source material, whether it's pain, mental illness, and things like that. There's textbooks filled with the science behind all of it, and we've decided to take a very concerted effort at abstracting that science into gameplay and designable components that anybody can really pick up and play, whether it's a child or an adult or a sufferer or somebody who just wants to learn more about the disease.
So we've got math games and cancer games. It's beginning to seem a little bit scary. Katherine, do you want to give us your
I can.
presentation? And,
Yeah, so
and maybe change to a little bit more cheerful than math.
I'm sorry.
I don't know. We're going to see about that. Yeah. So I thought we should each have sort of a position statement. So I'm just going to blow right through this very quickly. This is where I am when I'm not here, the Game Innovation Lab at NYU. What I'm doing here at Stanford is I'm working, among many other things, on a book for MIT Press for a series called Playful Thinking, in which you launch an argument about games that's interesting to people who are not avid gamers. The premise of my book is that game designers have developed new techniques for evoking powerful social emotions in players that are not found in other media. And I think this is something that many people don't understand about games. So here's a quote that really brings it home. This is by a world-famous game designer, Will Wright, who created The Sims, among other games. And he says, people talk about how games don't have the emotional impact of movies. I think they do. It's just a different palette. I never felt pride or guilt when I was watching a movie. And he tells a story about playing this game. This is many years back, called Creature Isle, Black and White Creature Isle. And in this game, the player has a creature that he trains. This is one flavor of the creatures. And you can mold an evil creature by being mean to it. You can mold a nice creature by being nice. So when he saw this game, being a guy who created simulations, immediately he starts slapping his character to see what will happen. And what struck him about this was he instantly felt extremely guilty. And then he got really interested in why he would feel guilty because this thing was not real. Okay? So why does this happen? Well, part of why this happens, and this gets at what one of the things Sebastian was saying, is that games are systems in which we make choices. And they're designed to be systems in which the choices we make have interesting emotional consequences for us. So that's just inherent, not to get too deep into definitions, but that's a part of what games do. If you think about psychological theory, if you think about modern understanding of how the mind works, how we decide how we feel comes from our own actions and our interpretation of those actions. So when Will comes to the game, he's initially thinking, oh, it's something I'm going to play with. But there's a virtual creature involved. And when he slaps it and he sees it being sad when he slaps it, that changes how not just his brain, but his body, his whole being interprets what's going on. And so it creates this kind of juxtaposition between I'm playing with a system and, oh, I've just damaged a little being. And that creates really interesting emotional terrain. So digital game designers have leveraged that fact to do a lot of interesting things in games. And to cover them all is way beyond what I could do today. That this is stuff of the book. But one I wanted to mention is avatars. And avatars are an incredibly interesting innovation from a media point of view. They basically extend what goes on in film with protagonists and in novels with protagonists. But avatars are basically this prosthetic for us in taking action in a game. And somebody asked a question this morning about why do I get so emotional about my car? Well, I think one reason is that the car is essentially a prosthetic body for us as we drive. And avatars are like this, and they work on multiple psychological levels. At a very visceral physical level, in terms of planning what we're doing cognitively, in terms of projecting who we are socially, and then it allows us to basically operate as a different fantasy person from our normal selves. So game designers have made really masterful use of this. And my book is full of examples primarily from independent and art games because I think they cover some different terrain than your average AAA game that you might have seen over the shoulder of somebody in your household. This is a game that actually leverages shooter game mechanics, but it's an art game. It's called Waco Resurrection, and it was created by an arts collective. And in this game, you basically inhabit the cult leader David Koresh, and you go through the storming of Waco that happened in 1993. And I want to read you something interesting that the designer says about this game. He says, one of the differences in making a game about an historic event is the nature of identification and implications. Games require the users to act, and as such appear to implicate the player in the actions of the avatar that they are controlling. This is rather obvious, but it does create new emotional experiences. Imagine a documentary about Hitler versus a fictional film with an actor playing Hitler versus a game where the player plays as Hitler. And he goes on to say, there were all these criticisms of the game, and one of them was that somehow it was going along with Koresh and his people. And he says, well, this is interesting because it's assuming that he's the protagonist and he's the hero. And that's not, in fact, the case. I'm having people explore this world. Okay, so that's one example. Another example is a game called Cart Life. I won't go into too much detail on, but this is a game where you actually try to survive as somebody operating a food cart in New York, very near and dear to my heart. It's very sweet, and it's lovely, and it comes from the texture of having to make little choices about what you're going to do as you're one of these cart vendors in the city. And the nature of games is that you can have this nuanced and lovely experience of trying to survive in this way that you kind of can't have with any other medium. So the last thing I want to mention that ties us into the tech world, because my lab is focused on tech, is a game I've been working on with an artist in residence in my lab. Her name is Kaho Abe, and she and I were really interested in seeing whether we could extend this fantasy identification that happens in online games for people into the physical realm. And so we're looking at using costumes as game controllers. So Kaho is really interested in the ways that combinations of costumes and poses can transform our feelings about ourselves, but also our social identity with each other. She was very inspired by this Japanese television show. She actually grew up in Japan, called Kamen Riders. And in the show, you wear a costume if you're the superhero, but you also have to strike a dramatic pose. So she was really interested in the physical feedback loop that comes from gestures and body, and the magic that could be unleashed by combining all these things. But she has an MFA in fashion design, so she sketched these elements that we're using and then built them out. This is a picture of Kaho. So this is the gauntlet she designed. She did 3D printing for the spikes. Basically, the interaction is two people. One person is collecting energy. The other one is using the energy. The collector has to do gestures to collect it. And then the person who's going to use it has to notice when the collection is full. They hold hands, and then they release the energy out into the game. And that's the core mechanic. So it involves close physical collaboration. So the game has been through multiple iterations and tests. And I wanted to mention that when my daughter tried this at an early play test, she actually developed a crush on this little boy she played with. And I realized it was partly because she was holding his hand. So it just shows you, it kind of completes the loop. If we think about the avatar as a sort of prosthetic in the virtual world, if you bring the body into this situation, then you're creating this interesting physical feedback loop for people. So we're now doing studies looking at the traces of connection and identity transformation from playing the game. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody about this moving forward. But just to show you that you can take some of these insights and you can bring them deep into areas like wearables and social play. So that's pretty much it for me.
Thank you. So, Romie, yes.
So, I'm a curator project director at the Tech Museum of Innovation in San Jose. And just a little preface about how we are different from a normal science and technology center that you might be familiar with. We are trying to create what we call the third type of museum. There's been a movement in museum exhibitions where the first type is you display something, you have text and people read it and they learn something. And the second, that's typically not very interesting unless people are already interested in it. The second type is where people can contribute. You know, he's like, here's a wall where we can put up a Post-it and have your say. And we want to push that a bit further and have this third type where you actually decide what your experience is about. And we have a few that we've already installed. We have a social robots where you building the robot and creating it, that is now the exhibition. And you learn things along the way. This most recent one that I just designed is called Bodymetrix, and the content is essentially the visitors themselves, their behaviors and activities. And it's a little bit difficult to describe this meta activity with words, so I'm just going to play a very short video. It's in collaboration with us and local projects, design firm in New York. And when the visitor comes in, we want to give them something that they can bring with them throughout the entire museum, personalizing their entire museum exhibits. And in this sense, it's going to be wearables. So EEG, heart rate sensor, and all of the sensors on an iPod Touch, which also serves as a kind of dashboard for everything that they're feeling and doing inside the museum. And it has two physical, 2 mental, and 2 social metrics that they can look at. And you don't have to look at your gear at all the entire time if you don't want to. But if you want to say, I want to be more social, or I want to be more focused, you can set that goal and it'll prompt you with activities you might go along with it. For the Bodymetrix Exhibition, we have activities that especially enhance energy that you're using, or stillness, or social activity. And at the very end, the culmination is this large format touchscreen display where you put down your kit and all of your data comes out. A time lapse from the camera, a little spark line from all of your activities so that you can make correlations and compare yourself to other people, or just see what the museum mood is overall. And that's essentially the experience. And the reason for this meta exhibit is that it's a health exhibit. We're sponsored by Kaiser Permanente to build this. And we're really pushing back on this idea that you should tell somebody how to be healthy in order to help them improve their health. If you guys are here at the Hive, I was saying, if you tell somebody not to drink soda or to eat cake, it kind of makes you want to drink soda and eat cake. So we want to give people an experience kind of context-free about how to build the skills of setting a goal, accomplishing something, paying attention to everything they do, the people they talk to, and seeing, are you more happy when you're talking with somebody else? Do you have a better attitude when you're physically active? And this idea of bringing it back to health is that just at the very end of the table, we have on the peaks where, hey, this is when you're most active, and you look at it. We say, hey, here's a little information about what you might do if you're interested in this topic, not even interested in improving your health. And you tap on it, and that'll go to their profile for their post-visit experience. And we just installed it. We're developing a ton of data that we're going to start looking at later with a big data analysis Hadoop company. And we're hoping that this becomes a platform for actual health and activity study inside a museum environment. But the personalization aspect is what made this exhibit even work. I like to say there's kind of a positive narcissism that people develop in a museum. It's an open space. It's like a space that's free of inhibitions, and they can build something even though they never build anything outside of the museum experience. It's a carte blanche to build something, and they want to share. They want this thing that they made to be important and real. And for this one, it's themselves. So, identifying with the avatar that is yourself and trying to improve it is, the goal they're trying to get across. Okay.
So we've got two very clear ideas of concepts of personalization going on there with Katherine's and Romie's. Let me tell you a different one based on my own company's BrainQuake. We bring out mobile apps to help people learn mathematics. The focus been on learning, not teaching. On the face of it, there is no personalization in what we do. There's no avatars, you can't change the color or anything, because our design metaphor is a musical instrument. A piano, on the face of it, is not personalized. It's just a device. Put a pianist in front of them, or a young child, everything then is personalized. You can tell the difference in everything. So if you build a device with the right functionalities, the way you build it the right way, individual people, simply by the way they interact with it, make it extremely personal. A pianist, anyone playing a piano, takes control, and what happens is extremely personalized. So you can get personalization without building it into the technology. You can actually just design an artifact so that when a person interacts with that artifact, they do the learning. So we call it playing mathematics with a deliberate two-way pun on that. You play mathematics in the way you play a musical instrument. It works well in mathematics because mathematics, like music, you've got a small number of primitives, and all of the interest in the excitement is the structure that you build on them. So providing you've got the primitives in the interface, like the keyboard or the device, the little wheels that we have on our first app, Was It Trouble, and another one's on its way, then the personalization emerges. So we build apps that are built to allow for emergent personalization with each individual person.
I was just going to say, I think some of what we do in games ties back to what Larry was mentioning in the morning about complex systems talking to complex systems and machines talking to humans. And game designers have always had to figure out how to take the multiplicity of people's performance in their games and still, on the other side, craft a relatively interesting and engaging and even somewhat predictable emotional experience. Yeah. And so that's basically a wicked problem that involves two very complex systems. So when Larry was speaking this morning, I was thinking, well, actually, game designers have a lot to say about that. Yep. Maybe more on a craft basis. They don't necessarily systematize that knowledge, but...
Yeah, but there is a lot of activity and there's a lot of personalization in our heads that you can leverage, of course. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about this in the context of yours? Because people come at your games with an interest, right? I mean, one's interest in cancer increases the older you get, right? For various reasons.
Definitely. No, I think it's the personalized aspect is I guess maybe to kind of talk on the designer point of view, we kind of want to assume what the player is going to want to do. And in addition to giving them that, you want to take that power away. I mean, I guess maybe when it comes to the design of any type of level, you want to make certain things easy. You want to have some sort of level of progression where things get more and more challenging. And more than anything, you want to challenge people's expectations through their own journeys that they make for themselves, through their own choices. So you want to, let's say, create a level where, you know, like we start as a stem cell in bone marrow, and you kind of want to introduce the player to the, in our game, to the idea of pluripotency. So the fact that one cell that starts as a stem cell can become many different types of cells. And you basically travel parts of the body in different tissues, kind of like you would see a typical microscopy plane or a histology plane. And you would see individual cells assume different identities, and then those identities have a specific function within the game. And you kind of experience that by filling in the gaps where they're there. And then by the end of, let's say, the third act, or the first act, you have to transform and metastasize to continue surviving throughout the game and to meet the game's expectations and challenges. And by doing that, you basically turn your back on all of the cell types you just learned about, the ones that you were personally taking part in the choices of, okay, you know, an immune cell attacks the bacteria. I turn myself into an immune cell. I attack the bacteria. I carried out the function that I'm expected to play in this game because that's the way the game delivered it to me. And then you
by the way, is there an adaptive engine behind there that sort of delivers things according to some sort of...
We have some artificial intelligence that kind of gauges how the player is playing.
Yeah.
More than anything else, we kind of want to treat every level like a set piece of human biology. So we want people to say, oh, you know, that looks like, you know, or you'll see, let's say, a beating flow, and you'll say, okay, well, that must be near my heart, right? Because, or I'm in an artery or a vein or something like that. But the nice thing is that we kind of, once you see all these different cell types, you assume their identities, you fulfill the game's requirements of playing as those cell types to solve a problem in our level. You turn your back on all of those things because you've now turned into the enemy in one form or another. And by taking that role, you assume a new identity, you personalize, again, choices that are forced onto you through the game's design and its mechanics. You pretty much have to turn your back on the body that pretty much you helped create and the biology, again, through an abstraction of the disease. We're not out, you know, this isn't a game about killing people. But it's a game about learning about the biology and understanding how and why, and you know, and then afterwards we go into, you know, the pharmacology, the drugs, and again, this is all done without words. It's done without text or anything like that. It's just little circles that you can manipulate and control on the screen.
Do you know Brenda Brathwaite's game Train? Because
Yes,
it reminds me of that.
Yeah.
So this is a board game. It's not even a digital game, but you're organizing little passengers on little trains and you're trying to optimize it. And at some point, either you realize at the end or some point along the way that you're basically taking them all to Auschwitz. And it's this incredibly powerful game. She's worked with Jewish organizations. She's a masterful game designer, but it's that sense of it puts the person in tension between I'm mastering a system and I'm taking a role that I find morally repugnant, and there's a lot of interesting emotional work that it's just nice the way you do that.
Yeah.
So we're actually developing a new exhibition right now, and it's not about cancer or the Holocaust or anything. So it's about making bacteria and designing something to solve an environmental problem. And it's going to be very immersive, and you send your creations out. And we started thinking about this idea of identifying with what you create. With Bodymetrix, it's extremely ham-handed. You are you. And I was trying to think with your game, like, I was thinking about who you identify with. Is it the person with the cells in there? Because that's the body, or is it the cell, or is the cell your creation? And so these are this kind of dichotomy that we're thinking about. And we realized it's really important that the cell in our exhibition, the cell you create is also you. So you design it to do a certain purpose, and that's where the learning comes in. But then we're also devising things where you kind of swipe your thumb, and then your thumbprint kind of forms into its shell, or it takes a little bit from your visage. This idea that it's your creation, but it's also you is, for some reasons, is such a powerful indicator, not just in the design process, but when you send it out and you keep watching it, you keep paying attention. It really extends the tail of people's interest.
Makes a ton of sense.
So we do have quite a representation of a broad spread of sort of what personalization cashes out to be. Let's go back to the question about why. I mean, we've sort of addressed that implicitly all the way through. Any one of you want to come in as to the personalization? Why? What do we get by personalizing? I mean, it's sort of rhetorical because I think everyone's got their own answer, but let's just, our job is to provide those answers.
I guess there's a personal investment in any game where, like a very large role-playing game where people clock in, hundreds and hundreds of hours, you can customize everything from the way they look. You can make your avatar look exactly like yourself. You are using this avatar as an extension of what your decisions and choices would be in that environment. So that is, an entire personalization. Taking that into choices that you wouldn't make, or in a situation or environment you never would find yourself, it's a learning experience as well, to personally invest yourself into what it's like to be cancer, or what it's like to be, organizing a train to Austerlitz.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, I think the neuroscientist who spoke this morning about how much pleasure and how much hardwiring we have in closely coordinating and collaborating with others. And I think that adaptive personalized systems really tickle that part of us. It's really satisfying. It makes us feel known, and we're literally wired to do that and orient to doing that. So it's really taking advantage of that quality we have.
For us, it's the idea of positive narcissism. People like seeing themselves, and we try to skew it positive by really emphasizing the collaborative aspect. So when you make something extremely personal, we want you to pair it with something that someone else has created, and not in a superior way, but that these are all things that are important to solve some problem. And I feel like the social aspect is what makes the positive narcissism or personalization powerful. Creating something and putting it in a dark room is far less effective than creating something and putting it up on a shelf.
Because on the face of it, it sounds as though personalization takes you in an opposite direction. Each person has their own individual experience, and it's not necessarily. I mean, those of us who wasted hours of our lives playing World of Warcraft know that the two exist together perfectly well, because no two people have the same experience in World of Warcraft. It's your own World of Warcraft, but it's unbelievably social. Even if you solo your way through, it's very social. So the degree to which the personalization is actually not taking you away from the social teamwork aspects.
Yeah.
In a sense, it sort of feeds into that.
Well, and there's a layer of design, as you were pointing out. It's like, that's why it's so important. And I think that's another thing game designers can really bring to the table, is they're very accustomed to designing not just the interaction for the person, but the atmosphere and the social interaction and the environment in which the overall thing is taking place. They're acting as conductors, orchestrating a complex set of variables. And I know when I was trained in HCI, I wasn't necessarily trained in those things. It takes some time to take those steps back and wrangle all of those factors to make things work.
One of the most scary pieces of video I've ever seen on television, and I won't say where. This was actually meant to be a math class. This was a room. There was about 200 kids in it, sitting in front of screens, each in their own little world. And the narration was saying each child has been presented with their own personalized courseware.
I think I saw that in real life. I think I saw that, and we're not going to talk about what it was.
No.
I was equally horrified in real life.
It scared the life out. I couldn't think of anything worse for learning to be a human being or anything. And I thought, if that's the definition of personalization, I want out.
Yes.
I don't hear anybody saying anything remotely like that. This is personalization for people to sort of learn how to collaborate and work together.
Well, I think a lot of people still have this idea of games as it's the pasty-faced person staring at the screen and the blue light flickering on their face. And I feel like part of why I'm writing this book is to just clear the air a little bit. There's so many other kinds of game experiences happening that are not like that at all.
Yeah, but is your game meant to be it's an individual player game, right? You sort of just play with that.
So we designed it in a way, and we had me and the other designer, Kevin, and programmer Radosh. We really took a lot of time to discuss the fact that, so when we kind of focus test the idea, a lot of people did not like it. We had discussions about how we wanted to manage sound. We wanted things to feel very visceral. We wanted, bodily functions to be heard throughout certain levels. We wanted voiceovers from surgeons talking about treatment therapies and things like that while the player is actively taking a role in in decreasing a host's or patient's health. And we felt that it turned out into two things. There were people that really liked the idea because they thought the abstraction delivered the idea in such a way that they could learn, and they were learning a lot, and they could learn in a much more enhanced, faster way than they would have, let's say, reading a textbook. And the other one, which usually were a handful of people, both people who were touched by cancer and people who weren't touched by cancer at one point in their life or through family and things like that, where they said it would just be too close to home. And I think, and this game it's the choice to the consumer to buy it or not buy it. But for us, what we decided was that this having two sides to the story would at least stimulate some sort of discussion. We could encourage people's minds to change in a way if they were willing to talk about why they didn't like the game or why they did like the game, and at least talk about the disease and how it affects us all personally. So it's almost as if that social moment and about your personalized experience and how you see it forces you to take a side, or doesn't force you, but invites you to take a side. And then once you're on that side, you're ready to engage in that discussion. It has nothing to do with the game. It starts with the game. The mind starts to change with the game, and then it gets outside of that experience, and you're willing to talk about it. You're willing to tweet about it. You're Facebooking it. You're sharing it. Even with this whole Let's Play phenomena on YouTube, where the top subscribed channel is somebody who just plays video games.
Sit there and plays,
Yeah, it's just sharing, and it's kind of creating that moment for a lot of people to discuss these things.
Okay, I think we're pretty close to the end now, so we'll end it there, and I'd like to thank the panelists.